Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're putting on our economist hats and taking an entirely unconventional view of the criminal justice system.
We are, specifically, a deep dive into the Thai CJS.
Right. And we're not looking at moral philosophy or human rights today. We're looking at market mechanics, incentives, and, well, efficiency.
That's exactly right. Our source material for this, a massive research project called Economic Analysis of the Thai Criminal Justice System, it forces us to treat this whole institution like any other complex system.
And to ask a really cold, hard question.
A very cold one, it asks. Are the laws, police, courts, and prisons producing optimal deterrence at the lowest possible social cost?
Okay, so let's unpack that a little. We're basically applying the logic of a cost-benefit analysis to crime.
Right. Treating everyone involved, criminals, victims, regulators, as rational actors just trying to maximize their own interests.
And our mission for this deep dive is to cut through all that complexity and see where this system is failing that economic test.
And the sources make it clear, I mean, right from the start, that the system is failing dramatically. The biggest problem is just severe systemic overload.
Overload. What does that look like in numbers?
Well, for context, back in the early 2000s, Thailand was spending about 6.5% of its annual budget on the CJS.
Which sounds pretty high.
It is, yeah. It's relatively high compared to a lot of other countries. But despite that spending, the system is completely buckling.
So the money isn't translating into efficiency.
Not at all. The courts face this growing, crushing backlog of undecided cases. And then you look at the correctional system. Prisons are operating at approximately 170% of their intended capacity.
170, wow.
Yeah. I mean, imagine trying to manage any infrastructure, a factory, a school with 70% more demand than it was ever designed for.
That's not just a humanitarian issue. From an economic perspective, it's a disaster. It really sets the stakes, and it echoes that powerful quote from the research.
Justice delayed is justice denied.
Exactly. You can't have an efficient economy, or society for that matter, if the mechanism for upholding laws is collapsing under its own weight.
And that leads us straight into our first section, the underlying economic lens itself. The field is generally known as law and economics. In this research, they call it Nitisatasat.
Nitisatasat. Okay, so how does it define the problem of crime? What's the core idea?
It all boils down to one foundational concept, the rational choice theory of crime. It's very cold and clinical.
How so?
It says an individual commits a crime if, and only if, the expected net benefits they get from that crime outweigh the benefits from, legitimate activities.
So it's a simple calculation in their head. Is the payoff from this crime, once you factor in the risk, better than the payoff from just going to work?
That's the whole calculation.
Yeah.
And what determines that risk? Well, the expected cost, the deterrent. It relies on two critical variables.
Which are?
First, the probability of getting caught, prosecuted, and convicted. And second, the severity of the punishment itself, whether that's a fine or jail time.
This is where it gets really interesting and I think potentially controversial. The principle of optimal deterrence.
Right.
If a government is trying to be purely efficient, what is the economically optimal way to set punishments?
Well, for an economist, the goal is to make the expected cost of the crime equal to the social harm it caused. Let's talk about a risk-neutral person for a second.
Okay.
This is someone who just cares about the mathematical average. They'll take a bet if the odds are good, even if the risk is high. They're not emotional about it.
They're a pure calculator. So for that kind of person, how do you structure the fine?
Mathematically, if you want the expected cost to match the actual harm, and the probability of capture is almost always low, say only 1 in 10 criminals gets caught,
Which sounds realistic.
then you have to increase the punishment tenfold to compensate.
So wait, if a crime causes, say, 10,000 baht of harm, but only 10% of offenders are caught, the fine has to be 100,000 baht. That sounds draconic.
Economically efficient, but socially very harsh. The pure theory says fines should be maximized right up to the offender's total wealth.
Why?
Because fines, unlike prison, are just a transfer of wealth. They don't generate the huge social costs of locking someone up. The goal isn't revenge, it's making the potential criminal stop and do the math.
A fascinating foundation. But the research says the Thai CJS isn't achieving this because of two huge systemic biases. Let's start with the first one, this bias towards criminal proceedings.
This is a major structural failure. The legal system overwhelmingly prefers criminal sanctions over civil ones, even for disputes that are, at their heart, private.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The sources highlight over 350 different laws that include criminal sanctions.
350. Wow. And what are some examples?
The big ones are private disputes like defamation and the use of bounced checks. And the sources explain why this happens. It's because private actors find it rationally advantageous to push these things into the criminal system.
Hold on, that doesn't make sense. If the criminal system is so slow, you said 2 years for a bounced check case. Why would anyone choose that over civil court?
Because the coercive power of the state is a massive lever. Using a criminal complaint gives you immediate leverage over a debtor. Plus, the system often delays the civil case until the criminal one is finished.
So even with the long wait, the criminal process is the only game in town to get things started.
It becomes the primary mechanism, yeah, regardless of efficiency.
And that's a powerful insight. So private self-interest is actively clogging the entire public system. The cost gets shifted from the private actor straight to the taxpayer.
And the cost is just staggering. The research calculated that it costs the state an average minimum of 76,612 baht to settle just one criminal case that gets to court.
76,000 baht. And that's just the state's cost.
That's just police, prosecution, court time, corrections. It doesn't include the private costs, like lawyers, or just the opportunity cost of everyone waiting around for 2 years.
And that time difference really drives it home. We said bounced check cases average over 2 years.
24.4 months. Contrast that with something like a minor gambling offense, which averages just 1.27 days to resolve.
That's insane. The incentives are completely upside down.
Totally inverted.
Okay, let's pivot to the second big problem, hypothesis B, this over-reliance on imprisonment. It's supposed to be the ultimate deterrent, but the economic analysis paints a very different picture.
Well, the costs of incarceration are extremely high for a few reasons. First, the obvious direct costs, housing, food. Second, the foregone earnings. The person isn't contributing to the economy.
Right.
But the most significant cost, the one economists really focus on, is the high social cost of stigma.
Defining stigma as an economic problem is key here. How does a social label translate into a number on a spreadsheet?
Stigma is what we'd call an economic externality. When someone is labeled a convicted criminal, they are effectively excluded from future labor markets.
They can't find a good job.
And if they can't find productive employment, society loses their output. But worse, that lack of legitimate opportunity, it dramatically increases the likelihood of reoffending. They just cycle right back into the expensive system.
It's a self-perpetuating cost driver. A fine is a one-time transfer, but prison generates future costs through this stigma loop.
Precisely. Monetary sanctions offer deterrence without those compounding negative effects. But despite this, imprisonment is still the main sanction. Fines are usually just for minor things, or tacked on to a suspended sentence.
Okay, so if fines are the efficient answer, that brings us to Section 3 and the proposed solution. The day fine system. But first, why is the current system of fixed fines so broken?
2 fatal flaws. First, inflation. The source material points out that maximum fines set decades ago, some back in 1956, have just appreciated into almost nothing.
So they've lost their punch.
Their real value has dropped to about 1/8 of what it was. It's just an annoyance now, not a deterrent. And second, there's a massive equity problem.
The fact that a 10,000 baht fine is crippling for one person and pocket change for another.
Exactly. It creates this strong pro-rich bias. It means the law is just not equally deterrent across society.
Which is where the day fine, or structured fine, comes in. It's a pretty elegant solution. How does it work?
It's a dual structure system. First, the court determines the gravity of the offense and assigns a set number of day fine units. That's the same for everyone who commits that crime.
Okay.
Second, they multiply that number of units by the offender's net daily income.
So the crime determines how many days you owe, and your income determines the value of each day. A CEO and a construction worker could both get 30 units, but the CEO's final bill would be dramatically higher.
Correct. It ensures the punishment is proportional to their ability to pay, which gets rid of that pro-rich bias. And because it's tied to current income, which generally tracks inflation, the fine automatically keeps its value over time.
It's self-adjusting. That sounds like a dream for efficiency. But is this just theory, or have countries actually done this?
Oh, it's absolutely not just theory. Day fines have been used across the Nordics for decades. Finland started way back in 1921.
Wow.
Germany and France also use them widely. And Germany is maybe the strongest case. Fines are the main sanction there, used in over 80% of criminal cases, even for things like assault, theft, and fraud.
That's a huge number. It shows fines can be the primary tool. But we have to talk about the failure case, the UK. It really highlights the challenge here.
Right. The UK tried day fines in 1992 but got rid of them after only 7 months. The problem wasn't the economic mechanism, it was resistance. Primarily from judges.
Right.
They felt the guidelines were forcing them to impose fines that just felt fundamentally unfair or disproportionate.
There was that famous anecdote, right, about the parking ticket.
Yeah, a judge was forced to issue a £500 fine for a parking offense because the offender was wealthy, but the car itself was only worth £250. The public and the judiciary just saw it as excessive.
So the math was efficient, but human perception of fairness got in the way.
Precisely. It shows the friction between a pure economic model and what society is willing to accept.
But when the system is implemented successfully, the data on its effectiveness is overwhelming.
It really is. The German research they cited is a crucial proof point. Reoffense rates were dramatically lower for people who got fines.
How much lower?
About 16% for offenders given fines, compared to a staggering 50% for those who were given prison time.
50 versus 16%. That's the smoking gun, isn't it? Imprisonment isn't just more expensive up front, it's less effective at actually preventing future crime.
It's proof that the negative externality of stigma is actively working against the goals of the whole system.
Okay, moving into our final section. Based on all this analysis, what are the concrete reforms being proposed?
The researchers lay out 3 main shifts. First, strengthening monetary sanctions. Basically require courts to use fines as the primary tool instead of prison for any sentence less than 1 year.
That would immediately tackle the overcrowding.
Immediately. Second is tackling the case backlog through compulsory mediation.
So forcing people to try and settle things first.
Yes, especially for those private dispute criminal cases. The data from early programs suggests a high success rate, around 50%. That would instantly cut that 76,000 bat state cost in half for a huge number of cases.
And the third, and maybe biggest, reform.
Fixing the root cause through large-scale decriminalization. This means eliminating criminal sanctions entirely for things that are just private disputes, like bounce checks and defamation.
And for minor regulatory stuff.
Move it out of the criminal courts. Things under the Transport Act or the Liquor Act should be handled with administrative fines. Save the courts for serious threats to public peace.
But all of these reforms, they rely on one thing we identified as the system's Achilles heel, data.
The data challenge is existential for any of this. Right now, almost all the available data is macro level, totals and summaries. You can't study individual factors. You can't properly compare the outcomes of fines versus prison.
And all the agencies, police, prosecutors, courts, corrections, they're all operating in their own separate data silos.
Exactly. You can't even track one case from start to finish. Right. The call to reform is for a unified data system. And critically, for day fines to even work, that system needs to start collecting basic micro data on an offender's occupation and income.
Information the justice system doesn't track at all right now.
Not at all. Without that data, equitable day fines are simply impossible to implement.
So, to sum it all up, this deep dive has shown us an overburdened, incredibly expensive criminal justice system. Its reliance on criminal sanctions and costly imprisonment for minor offenses is just economically inefficient.
But the economic analysis does provide a clear, data-driven path forward, things like mandatory mediation and income-based fines. It shows that optimizing social welfare often means moving away from traditional, costly punishment.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. It goes right back to that UK failure case.
It does. We learned that, theoretically, an efficient punishment should be based on maximizing deterrence. But studies show the public often rejects these punishments, like a huge fine for a minor crime, if they feel they're fundamentally unfair.
So that raises a powerful question for you.
When you're reforming the criminal justice system, if economic efficiency saves huge amounts of public money and resources, at what point does society value the feeling of traditional, punitive, justice-like mandatory prison and social stigma over maximizing what is verifiably better for social welfare and efficiency?
A profound conflict between the ledger sheet and the conscience. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.